Hello, hello. How's it going, everybody? Nicola, I think I saw you in the chat. Hey, got the wrong window up over here. Gabe, good to see you as well. That hasn't updated yet. Oh, I was about to hit the stream button and I noticed my mic had like reset itself. So hopefully this sounds fine. Let me know if I need to like bump up the volume or something. My gain might be on the low side, but we'll work with it. Let me know. So today I've expanded my green screen a little bit, and it's got my whole corner of my desk. Too many things in flux, but we're here. We're doing the thing. So today we teased it a little bit in the past couple weeks, but I want to start getting into. We've looked at app state, right? So we used the store plugin in one of our it was in the to-do list, I think. We used it in the to-do list, and that works for like every time you open the app, your data will be back. So there's ways that you can basically persist it to the device that you're using. So a little bit longer lived than something that might just be in the browser. Every time you close the app, it resets. So where do you go from there? Data. You might have noted my amazing pun. I'm very proud of myself. Databases. So in some ways, it's the same. The same as an web app. You have a database, or you have a service, or something that takes an indication of persisting data outside of like just that app. And you can do things like tie it to authorization, authentication, so as to make sure that the data is only shared with the people that it's intended to be shared with. But I think what is maybe not specifically unique to Tauri, but when we're thinking about implementing it in Tauri, you kind of have a local backend. So in some ways, the data or the data service doesn't have to be a cloud thing. And I think this is a place where we can explore local first apps in a bigger way than potentially the options that you have in the browser. Or at least in a different way, or a slightly modified way, because we can in some ways think of our the Rust builder backend of our app as a server. And in theory, that could be something like a peer-to-peer sync client. And I haven't really seen anybody talking about that. I mean, even just the local first thing, like in general, I feel like that's an architecture that it's just starting to get its feet. There's a handful of communities out there. There's a handful of services now that are doing this, and that they're sort of like they're handling the whole pie, as it were. Because doing this is sort of also dependent on infrastructure, as it is right now, because you need the backend to exist and exist in a way that it can handle this type of architecture. But that's deep. And that's probably multiple streams of things we can dive into there. What I want to start to look at, though, is just that first step. Like, I have data on this device. How do I get it outside of this device? How do I persist it outside of this device? So I think the first step to that is looking at a SQL app. I'm gonna pop over here. I was actually just seeing if we can get the stream to do app working. I built it and I was going to run it, and then we ran into all those issues that I said that I was going to fix, and then I completely forgot about because my computer restarted. I'd made one change right before I was found out my mic was not cooperating. Well, actually, a couple changes, but I made one change that I haven't actually tested yet. And is it running? Did I? Oh, yes. Yeah. I built. Let's do a quick install. And let's see if it works. If it works, we will use it and see what doesn't actually work. Target. Did I run a release build? I think I ran a release. We're sending it, right? Yeah, we're sending it. If you're unaware, this is helpful. Did you fix the multiple tray icons bug? No, not yet. That is I mean that's less a bug and more just an artifact of the dev setup. I suspect it won't actually persist in when we bundle. And where is the bundle? Here it is. Okay. We'll see how wrong I am about that. But the first step was actually getting it to run because, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's just run the dev version right now. There was a, I don't know if it's a bug upstream in the main, like in Tauri main, but it seems like there's a permission error when I build for release, and that appears to be the reason for that white screen. So I updated everything. Oh, it's visible. Come over here, please. Yeah. So there's a couple things. Tray position not set. So that's an issue with the positioner plugin. And depending on how you start or otherwise, like these settings seem to affect in that initial setting of state. And this actually kind of comes back to our state conversation. It's using like the ephemeral state within built into like the Tauri builder side of things. And when you make changes, it saves that state. It doesn't, at least the way that I'm initializing it, there doesn't seem to be anything that's actually setting that initial state. So this was the last thing that I changed before I built. We might be able to like trick it if we do this. Resizable false. So that was the last issue that I had. And that would, I don't know a great way to deal with that upstream either. Because is that a type of state that you want to persist outside of like restarting the app? Maybe. But then you're making assumptions on how the user of that plugin wants to actually save that state. It might just be that I'm holding it wrong. So if this doesn't work, why are we taking so long to build? If this doesn't work, then I'll have to deal with it outside of this. And then there's a couple of things. So that Gabe, that multiple tray icons issue, I'll probably fix it first in that template. And I think I also didn't commit stuff from the previous stream. Computers, I tell you. Just like running in a stream of constant issues that block pushing stuff out, and then yes. I'm at that I feel like everything like ebb and flows. I'm at that state of like I just want everything to work right now. I don't want to like dive into stuff too much. I got too many things that are just like partly broken and I just want them all to work. I'm sick of debugging all of these random issues. Why is this taking so long? Let me just restart it. Okay, so as far as our here we go. So now this isn't even working. Oh, maybe it is. Maybe it is. Just took a minute to load. Okay. Yeah, see, we still have. This might be something like with the ID too. Good question. And the checkout. Oh, this might have actually persisted correctly from the last time we looked at it. Yeah. Speaking of persisting the data, there's still something going on with this type of persistence too. If I delete them too fast, there's some like async process that hasn't finished that I think I'm canceling. Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna check out the SQL plugin. Then we're going to Paul, who has stopped by the stream a handful of times. He actually had a question on the SQL plugin, and he sent me like his. I think it's a little bit more of a test app, or I think he's sort of like telegraphing that this might be a place where we can use pieces or all of it as part of the docs. Based on I was talking with him my previous evening. So we'll pull that out, and that'll give us a little bit more deeper example of how it's all hooked up, and that might dictate if we actually want to pull up and start our own like test implementation. Because I don't have a place where I want to implement it at the moment. There's a couple apps that I do eventually want to, but not right now. So we're gonna check out the SQL plugin docs. Actually, here, let me check out SQL plugin docs. Then we want to gotta fix my posture to type well. Then we're gonna check out the example from Paul. And then I think we might, I don't know if we're gonna find any other implementations, but we can see if there are other implementations out there. Sure. Okay, so we're in dev mode, clearly, right, Gabe? All right, so first thing, we are, where are the docs? Here's the docs. Haha, yes. Yeah, that is just, I think like that's the kind of stuff too that's going to be helpful to chuck in the docs. We don't actually have a docs section for the tray yet either, so that's definitely on my to-do list, but it just like it hasn't quite hit that top of the priority list yet. We added this context, and I think that's sufficient for the store. We're probably going to end up doing the same for positioner. but also with positioner. I should make an issue for this. Let's do that right now. So we have some work on previous stream that should likely close this. But what I want to do is add functionality to positioning to right align the tray. The SQL plugin docs, nice. I always appreciate folks hopping in and getting involved. So we'll read through your fine work in a moment. So this potentially could be in tandem with updating the docs, but what we found was the positioner plugin had functionality to position the app relative to the tray icon. The plugin has the ability to position the app relative to the tray icon. However, it only aligns on the left side of the app. Whoop. Let's just remove this. I don't know why. I was trying to type motivation by type migration. However, it only aligns the left side of the app. Can we implement functionality to allow aligning on the right side of the app? Because what was happening was when we click the icon, we have it positioned center right now, but the problem was if it was positioned right, there was cases where the app was actually like getting cut off by the end of the edge of the screen. And I think in both of our cases, the tray is going to be on the right side of the screen. But this is also potentially something that would fall in the user settings section. Because I gotta imagine that there's folks out there that are like customizing it or somehow shifting the tray to be in a different spot. And that's probably something that we could enable through customization that way. Okay. So this is actually here this may be functionality that is valuable upstream in the plugin. Okay. So that's sort of our two pieces of like next steps that we want to do as far as docs and functionality go with this. And if anybody is interested in jumping on these, I don't think we're going to get to these for a little bit. So if you're interested in pushing this specific template forward, single instance or auto start plugin would be lovely to implement. So anyways, onto the SQL. There is, so we did start. We just mentioned that. There's also Stronghold, which is more intended for secrets. There's some encryption type stuff involved. You would love to implement auto start, Nicola? That would be lovely. And also auto start is marked as a whip too. So if you do want to jump in on that, I would be happy to support that, especially if you want to update the docs. I feel free to tag me on that too, and we could if you want to add a few lines to the docs. I would be grateful to see that be implemented, and I would be happy to support that. Perfect. Yeah, great. Thank you again. So Store and Stronghold are sort of the next step outside of like I want to persist my data like outside of the context of the web view / app. Both are a little bit longer lived, but they don't have the ability to, at least I don't think Stronghold does. I don't think so. They don't have a way to persist that data outside of a device. So we're not even talking users at this point. Like, I just want to open up the app on my phone and on my Windows computer and on my, I guess phone would be, tray apps are, but there is mobile support. So in theory, I would like to be able to open this thing up on my Windows box, on my Mac, and on my phone. So even if we had some sort of like syncing local store thing and we weren't even caring about users at all, we still need to somehow persist it. And I think that is likely going to be where the SQL plugin comes into play here. Need to move this off my screen. Things moving in my peripherals always bugs me. I had the task manager up on the left side there to kill this app when I was misbehaving. Anyways, SQL. So part of this is, and you can actually see this in some of the other plugins too. If you're working in the context of a web app, that web app can save things to like local storage, or there's like IndexedDB or whatnot. But as soon as you want to like persist it outside of the device, you're likely looking at some sort of service that you're hitting. And in that process, you're communicating directly with the service or hitting something that eventually hits the service that you care about. What's interesting about some of the plugins in Tauri is that you don't have to use that exact architecture. You can. But if you look at something like the WebSocket plugin, for instance, you can open up a WebSocket connection and have that communicate with an outside service. The way this plugin is implemented, it's actually going through the Rust layer, and the Rust build, like Tauri builder portion of the code, is the thing that like handles that connection. And the reason this is potentially valuable is now that state is in a place that it can that state can be used in multiple windows. And that like connection doesn't need to be, if you have 5 windows, you don't need to open up that connection 5 times. With the plugin, you can have it at the like Tauri builder level, and then that data can be then delivered to each of the separate windows. And in the same way, you'll see that in the SQL plugin. So we got, ooh. I kind of dig that. We really, I think this is another thing on the in people's heads to-do list. This is gonna be fun to go through. They're like making some of these things more consistent because we have like all of our installs are, there's an automatic and manual in some of them, and like this is seeming to be the pattern that is developing. Yeah, most, or at least a good chunk of them have this automatic and manual. And then in the usage section, so like this positioner plugin, this is something that we can, when I come back to it and look at this, there's a JavaScript, and then there's the Rust implementation. If we look at like the store, JavaScript and Rust, so I think those patterns are starting to evolve. But we digress. Speaking of digressing, no wave. I am not sure how to best pronounce your alias, so please let me know. Also, the exclamation mark 3D command. You can chuck some test text in there. No weave, not now weave. Okay, now weave. You've been using V2 alpha and migrated everything to beta, but you're still having errors at Tauri config. At app did so alpha and even into beta a little bit. The whole point of that is like to test the API service to make sure there's no like latent bugs, and as that happens, there's less there's less expectation to the user that things are going to be in a steady state. As we get into out of the beta phase and into the RC phase, that's when the APIs are intended to be more stable, and we're like, we're at a point where things shouldn't drastically change, and what is going to be valuable is people basically kicking the tires and making sure that all of those bugs and issues are worked out. Alpha is sort of like no holds barred. Things are gonna change. so like the short answer is yes, it probably has changed a bunch. The tray icon stuff has changed. I think I've updated it maybe 3 or 4 times on stream now. Like API names and things are just like shifting a little bit. It's not like huge functional changes, but it's enough to, anytime you have an update within an alpha series or alpha to beta, you're gonna have some breakage. I can pretty much guarantee that. Unless you're like constantly upgrading every version, then those breakages might be less often, depending on what you're updating. But yes, long story short, yeah, there's probably going to be things you need to update. There is, I'm trying to think, when the beta came out, I think I did a couple migrations. So if you need a little bit of a something to work in parallel with to help you get unstuck, probably like 3 or 4 months ago, I did a couple streams upgrading different apps and going through the migration process. Okay, so you're upgrading with a plugin architecture. Plugins are nice because you can split out functionality and you can kind of like you can implement them separately, and it focuses those implementations a little bit more. The downside is that like it's a lot more difficult to get the compatibility between them working. Minecraft mod pack launcher, nifty. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly like, if you're gonna go through the work of upgrading, I've tended to just upgrade all the things and deal with all of the issues, depending on the version to version upgrade. Though that path that might be a lot. But basically, long story short, it's hard to get like interversioning. Like, does this alpha work with this beta version, or vice versa? It's hard to get that right, and it's hard to communicate that, and it's probably not even very well known very well. But if you upgrade everything at the same time, like that's a known state that in theory should work. Like I said, things will get more stable once the RC phase comes out, and I think we're getting pretty close to that. Okay, so SQL. This is probably the, and I don't know like specifically what you got into here, Gabe, but whoever wrote this is part of the information that I appreciate. Like at a high level, I know exactly what I'm getting into. And I think in some ways we could even expand on this a little bit, and maybe this is part of the work that would potentially help pull it out of work in progress. But this isn't a SQL database that's somewhere else. Oh, applying migrations. Oh yeah, that's a good one. That's a whole nother like. Yeah. Cool. Um, this is using SQLX, and that's actually running like within around the Tauri builder, or I guess within the context of the Tauri builder. And applying migrations is then the thing that you need to start to think about, because you're actually basically running like the back end and the front end if you're thinking it in terms of web app. So that complicates the migration process of it. The benefit is that you are communicating directly with like a local database, and the potential for user control of that is in some ways both a pro and a con. Now you're working on Next OS docs. Neat. You started a PR on the docs that adds requirements and stuff for Next OS. Cool. I haven't it seems neat. I haven't actually progressed any further past the it looks neat stage. um like I started the stream with I'm in the I'm sort of like bouncing the plane off the ground of I just want stuff to work right now phase. And Linux is definitely not on my Linux GUI and distros are not on my to-do list of things I want to dive into. But Next does look pretty nifty. So I think this is the important bit of SQL. And I think it's sort of, we don't really have other plugins that, or any other plugins that sort of like fall into this. I guess if we look at the plugin workspace, I think the overlap is pretty much the same. But also, like if we can even look here. There might be stuff in here that's on a to-do list. I'm not gonna distract myself too much with that. But as far as like actual plugins go, in the official plugins workspace, the like next step up of persisting your state somewhere, SQL is pretty much at least the SQL plugin is pretty much the only real option. And maybe that's, I think that would be like that kind of context would be helpful here, is that this is a way to implement and or use a database that's like built into your app. That doesn't preclude you from using it or using databases in the same manner as you would with a web app. I guess in theory you could do both, and in some ways that's, I think, part of what interests me with the local first ideas is that if you have a database locally, even if it's like SQLite, is probably going to be sufficient for most local first use cases. I would imagine it can scale pretty decently, and user scale, I think it's functionally going to be able to hit the bulk of the use cases. So if you have a local SQLite database built into your app, potentially giving you more direct control of that data, that allows you to work without a connection. It allows you to control your data more directly, but then also it doesn't necessarily prevent you from then also syncing that up into some place in the cloud that would allow outside of your local network access. So I think that's like, I think that's the bit that's really interesting, and that type of context is probably the pieces that I would add to this. Pretty typical install stuff. I do appreciate the git or the npm notes. Have we started doing that in other cases too? Like being able to do get in JavaScript is still a little bit. It works here because we've basically like copied these pieces outside of the monorepo. Because that's really like, as soon as you use a monorepo within the JavaScript ecosystem, doing this, you start to lose this functionality. But I do like this because we've gone through the effort of setting that up, and there's potentially value in using that because it is marked as a tag, so tags can change. But you could also like set it to a specific commit, and in some ways that's going to be if you're really security conscious, that's potentially one way to like reduce the supply chain attack vector. If you're relying on a specific commit, that commit can't change. Otherwise, you're gonna like have some indication that it has. Crates in Rust are pretty well set up to do that already, which is really nice. Anyways, okay, so usage. We added as a plugin. And I guess we don't really have an automatic option here. And in some ways, that probably makes sense. And we could maybe note this in here, but adding it as a plugin works for some APIs. And dump it in there, and it's just gonna like start doing that thing. This is gonna be a little bit more involved. So with the plugin, we get the JavaScript APIs. And we can like hit those directly, which is kind of cool. And I think I do want to like look into this a little bit more closely, like what this is doing. That might not be a today's stream thing, but this starts to fall into in some ways, some of these like other local first libraries out there that are implemented in JavaScript or equivalent. They're basically like working directly with the database, and then that database is synced. So if you squint enough, you can start to see the workings of that. Okay, so query syntax, and I'm presuming that this is all JavaScript. This looks JavaScripty. Yeah, there's an await. I mean, I guess await doesn't. This looks like JavaScript though. I thought we had this might be a potential to do. We have a bunch of code blocks like this. When we are doing the tabs, let's see if we can find one like this. It's at least somewhat reasonably clear what language that code block is in because of this functionality. When we're doing this, it would be nice to have like a little tag in the corner or something like that that says JavaScript. Like this isn't, I mean, we're you know, I'm not blaming anybody, just to be clear. This is would just be one of those nice things to add. So this looks like JavaScript, so we can or we can do queries. We can load. I'm guessing that also initializes as well. But reading through the migration section might be yeah, okay. Once you've initialized it, then you can load the database and start executing on it. Either queries such as queries or mutations. Inserts, insert. We also had I thought I saw a more of a get type. No, it looks like it's all mutation. All the examples are mutations, which is fine. So I think probably the main prerequisite then is that we will likely need to do a database migration. And we can maybe check out this code too. Like if we're doing a SQLite database, where is that stored? DB load and DB init do the same thing on the front end. Okay. So and in some ways, like we start to get into this is a high level guide. How deep do we go? And where do we start saying check the API reference? You had to migrate the CLI commit. Oh, nice. Seems like it was a relatively benign fix then. Gotta love those. Yeah, so I guess that context and then pointing to the migration section might be useful. Each migration should include a unique version number, description, SQL, and the type of migration. Okay. Got it. All right. Like this is useful, but is there going to be use case where you don't? I mean, I guess in theory, can we do migrations on the JavaScript side of things? I suspect that migrations are going to be pretty purely I mean, they have to be runtime because when you're updating your app and you're adding to the schema, you need that schema to be migrated on the user's side. So like it has to be a runtime migration. But where you're putting it and configuring it, this seems like it's going to be a Rust only kind of thing. In which case, to get a new migration, you need to basically give them a new updated version of the app. In which case, I can't imagine a place where we would be using this syntax. It's almost always going to be this syntax. I think I mean it's really hard to say. Docs are definitely communication is difficult, right? I like when code snippets are something you can copy and paste and run. Technically, you could read an SQL file on the Rust side, triggered by a JS side invoke. In theory, yeah. That can make sense. Basically, like a user, almost in some ways like a user side database migration. That sounds dangerous. User provided migration, yeah. Playing with fire there, that's what it sounds like to me. Yeah, so I guess like usage seems simple here, but in reality, it's not. More than likely, you're gonna end up using this. So I think in some ways, like tying that together, and then designing ways where we point to actual API guides or API references to give more information about this would be helpful. So we define a migration and then we add them. I presume it's in the vein of that these migrations, there's some migration table that basically handles and determines if these migrations are applied, so that it's a continually growing list of migrations effectively. Okay, you do have a note here. Alternatively, the client-side load also runs the migrations for a given connection string. Okay. And that would be add migrations. Okay, so you can apply it when the plugin is initialized, or you can also run it. I'd be curious, like what's the use cases behind those? That's coming from SQLX. Nice. I'd be curious, like what's the use cases behind these? Like what would this feels like the default in my mind? Like this would be the one that I would default to. Is there a use case though for like letting load also run it? I guess since it was not documented before. Yeah, I believe that. I mean, as you can see with all the whips, I would be curious, like what's the use case behind that, and that's potentially something we can start to dig into too. And I guess in some ways too, pointing. This is built on top of SQLX, right? In theory, you can use other SQL libraries too, and it's probably going to be very similar. I don't think this allows you to swap out the SQLX portion of it. So you'd have to end up like writing your own plugin if you want to use a different crate. But at some point, I think this is a place where we don't need to redefine or redocument everything that SQLX already has, in theory. The one caveat to that I would say is that it is more likely that we have folks coming in from a JavaScript or web app type of background, which might not be as familiar with diving into SQLX. So like that would be the pieces that I think would make sense to document the most, which we've like hit on all the high level stuff. I think what we have here is good, honestly. It's just going to be like fleshing out thoughts and trying to answer some of those questions before they come up. So I think that pretty much. Okay, yeah. Let's check out this. The each migration must have a unique version number. Yeah. Okay, and this actually speaks to that question before. My presumption was that this is a growing list of migrations that are effectively like checked or otherwise rerun on every initialization. Testing, yeah. That's a very interesting piece, because I mean, in theory, you can manually test it. Migrating databases though aren't for the faint of heart. That's my feeling, at least. It feels like it's easy to accidentally goof things up, and in a way that is hard to roll back. So this testing part is definitely in general, I think I would like to get into testing more, but like this is definitely a piece that would be like great to expand on. Like I don't even know if that's like specifically a Tauri thing though. All right. So I think this kind of gives us a high level. We are from, and I'm assuming in Rust as well, but the main reason you'd use this plugin specifically is that JavaScript API. Because in theory, you can pull in any crate and wire it up into like with like the Tauri builder. So you can use SQLX. You don't have to use it through this plugin, and you could do it all in Rust. But then you're starting to miss out on some of the syntax. So you'd have to figure out in some ways how to do that communication, if at all, to get that data to the front end. So if you want a little bit more direct control over that content in the web view, I think that is probably the main use case for this plugin. And communicating that in here would be I think the probably most beneficial update here to our existing docs. Do we have any API references? Let's just check those out real quick. Does Tauri have good guides in making a Rust crate to a Tauri plugin? I think the short answer is no. The expanded answer is that would be difficult to document in a succinct but deep way. Because here, let's pop over to this app that we've got running right here. If we look at you might have to squint a little bit. This might be different in your case, but I've got a main RS. You might have a librs depending on how you have it set up. This is Rust. There's some functionality in here, with the builder or the command syntax that makes it easier to operate and work with like the Tauri builder. But in theory, you can do anything in here that you could do in a normal or non-Tauri Rust program. So there might be cases where we could communicate that better, or at least like, yeah, like it's, how do you go about communicating that? I guess is the part that would be difficult, because you could pull in any Rust crate. So like if we're on the topic of SQL, you could pull in another SQL crate. There's there's a few big ones, right? Like Diesel is another one. See if I can spell Diesel right. Diesel. I got it right. Nice. You can use this. You would follow the guide here and hook it up. Like this, you're doing this. And then it would just be like, how do you want to integrate it with Tauri? I think probably the best approach is I think Gabe's hitting that nail on the head. It's now that we have the plugin architecture for V2, I think there's a place where even if you're working on an app and you're doing an implementation specific to your app, it still could make sense to write it as a plugin, because having that like separation of concerns can be helpful. And I think potentially once you see the plugin setup and how it's integrated and like that integration point and like the couple hooks that you can hook into there, I think that could give folks enough tooling or knowledge to be able to just integrate it directly with their Tauri app. I think, do we have some semblance of a guide for that, I think, right? Plugins overview. We have a little bit. In some ways, though, this is a little bit more of an API referencey. And it isn't. Maybe it makes sense to just expand on this a little bit more. And that, I guess that starts to come back to when I updated this. Part of what we actually did a whole stream on going through docs and like writing some docs on, and Simon came on the stream too when we were doing the co-host thing, and one of the things that I said during that stream was that I think some more of the interlinking between docs would actually be really helpful, because we don't need every guide to be holistic, but we can point in between guides. So like this is saying, well, there's other options for state. You might want to check out this, which I don't think we've actually merged this in yet. I'm actually surprised that that hasn't gotten merged in yet. We've got a big guide on state management, unless that is just broken. Is that supposed to end with a slash? It hasn't been merged in, but also the link appears to be broken. Interesting. I feel like somebody noticed that it was broken, and I thought somebody appeared to fix. Maybe that hasn't gotten merged in either. Anyways, interlinking. I think the interlinking would be helpful, and maybe that's where we start to point to like this fits this specific purpose. If you want to do something outside of what this plugin can do, you're likely going to be implementing a plugin or directly implementing it. See these guides. And then we're basically funneling all those questions to like this guide. And in some ways that, like, knowing that this exists here might not be obvious. And hopefully by having other places linking and this interlinking and having those the plugin guides or the learn section point to these other pieces, hopefully that'll like help lift the fact that this exists. So now you said example, you've got the create Minecraft essentials. I vaguely know what that is. You want to create it because of the Minecraft auth and stuff, and make it easier for people to use your crate for that purpose. Okay. So is this? So you've got a mod launcher, right? I have done my fair amount of dabbling and playing Minecraft, so I've got a little context here actually. So the launcher and the auth would be like, are you replacing the actual Minecraft launcher? So this would be auth to actually auth with. Is this like to kick off the auth through Microsoft and log in with your Minecraft account? I guess Microsoft account into the Minecraft ecosystem. So I guess off of that then is so you've got a Rust crate to do this. Is this a crate intended for other folks to, okay, custom auth. Is this a crate where folks are going to be using the mod launcher app, or are they going to be creating their own app? Like, are you making a lib or are you making an app? Sounds a bit like you're doing both. But yeah, I think it's for developers. Okay, so a little bit more in the lib side of things. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is probably going to be the place where we've got the most information around. And maybe overview is not a great word. If we say plugin, what is that? Yeah, see, there's a mobile plugin development. I'm almost tempted to say we say, like, rename it off of overview. Yeah, thanks for stopping by, Gabe. Good to see you. Yeah, so I think if we're trying to communicate that you can use SQLX, and if you want to use something different, like, we should probably be pointing him to this, and this would allow you or give you hooks into a way you can implement it with a pretty clean abstraction, I guess. So then I guess, yeah. Basically point to that guide. I think that's probably going to be the way to go. So anyways, I guess as far as the API reference goes, there's not too much once we hit the JavaScript side of things. Select get, okay. Okay. Load select, what select? Best is a select query. Got it. Okay, so select is a get, execute is a mutation effectively. Okay. And then, like, I think anything past this is when you start to get into SQLX documentation. I think maybe from here, let's check out, where do I have that? So Paul shared this with me. Let's make sure, it's not still on a branch, is it? No. No. And I did confirm that it's okay that we go through it on stream. I don't want to put people on the spot or otherwise feel like I'm judging. And I don't know that we're gonna run it. I think probably just looking at the code is gonna be sufficient enough. Because what we care about is the, like, how those pieces are wired together and how an actual implementation ends up looking relative to, you know, like what our guides say. Guide plugin, SQL. So we want to kind of compare what this says we need to do relative to what you actually end up needing to do, at least in this implementation. So you can see they're using Svelte. And static is icons. So we got an app HTML, some Svelte stuff to get it going. This is going to be the main page. The rest is the Chrome or the pieces around it. So you can see there's the import database. They're using SQLite. And as Gabe, and I think the docs mention this too. Man, I have the hiccups. I'm trying not to make it audible, but I feel like it's getting worse. So apologies. Yeah, the client-side load also runs the migrations for a given connection string. So like this would be sufficient enough to run the migrations if there's any that need to be run. And that happens at fetch. Oh, on mount. So then they fetch the to-dos on mount. And like this comes back a bit to like that same issue with when we were initializing the tray, and we've got this situation going on. In some ways you can think of a Tauri app as a web app. The web view is the front end. The back end is the Tauri Rust builder. The front end communicates over effectively a very similar protocol to the back end. Where it starts to differ, though, is that any of those interactions end up all being async, and they can kind of run, or there's some expectation that they're running out of band from the rest of the app. And so like with the tray, if you're initializing or otherwise mutating or doing anything with the tray when the app loads, that's kind of a one-time thing, and it can potentially happen outside of your actual app. Whereas when you're doing a web app, the root or the thing that's initializing or first running tends to be like the React code that's kicking everything off, or your Svelte code that's kicking everything off. And you get this kind of architecture where on mount you're doing the Tauri things, and this feels natural coming from a web app background. But I feel like you end up running into these issues where like you're sort of putting the native functionality in a place that doesn't make as much sense. And I'm finding this more and more that like we haven't really communicated that in the docs. Where okay, all right, where is that button? This one. I put it within React, so now every time React reloads, I'm getting this situation. And also in some ways, like this might just be a dev time thing, but also depending on how and where your code is running, if your app doesn't load, you might have no functionality. So in some ways, you might want to do like the native work ahead of time, or do the native work before the rest of your app loads. So if you have some like app crashing error or something, there's still a place where like enough of it has initialized that the user can actually control and otherwise close the thing. And I think that's the bit of architecture that, as I'm piecing more plugins together, that's maybe something that we can work to communicate a little bit better or provide better patterns for. I feel like it's kind of the same issue with when you see new releases from libs, they always have this like bespoke example, do this little piece of code and you get all of this effort, it does all these things, but then they're like, but don't write it this way. This is we're not saying use this pattern. We're saying this is a potential pattern that you could use, but don't use it. It feels like it's a little bit in the same vein where it's like my default is to do something like this, but then now every time it would like hot reload, or like every time the window opens or something, like this is going to be run. And it was less of an issue in V1 because you had to do more work. Effectively, your only option was to do a bunch of this work in the Rust side of things. And the life cycle setup of that is different than in the web view. Hey Chubb, you can listen function to have a state and avoid returning with invoke. Yeah, and I think that's the thing that isn't like immediately obvious, at least as far as our docs go. Like if you're reading through it and you see a little snippet like, oh, I can do where is it? Like I can do this. I think the natural thing is to like, this is a side effect. I'm going to throw it in something like this. We did the same here. There's a in the hooks. So this is this to-do app, just for additional context. We set up the tray, we set up the store and the shortcuts. It's all sort of side effecty and happening on mount. But it, in some ways, I don't think that actually makes sense the more I've gotten into it. Because there's almost a differentiation between like what's native functionality and what's like your web app functionality. So we in this case we're looking at Paul stopped by this stream a handful of times. We're looking at one of the apps that they I think they're considering it more of like a POC level, but it's using the Tauri plugin SQL, and they're setting it up with SQLite. So that's what we were just getting into. So this is actually setting up a SQLite database, loading it on the website, web view side of things. But we'll look at it in a minute. But the migrations and like plugin initialization are all still on the Tauri builder side. So here's a invoke, and here's that execute, insert, invoke. I'm a little curious what so we've got an add to do and we've got an insert. So this would be the database. This would be add to do. So this grabs the data. And here's another. Okay, so they like refetch once they delete. Yeah, and like these handles too, I think you should really only need one handle to that database. Yeah, like you should only really need one handle to the database. So like those are the pieces that I think the docs we can work on communicating that better in the docs. Because like every time you're calling this, you're like reloading it, which is going to potentially be an issue depending on the work that you're doing. Where's this add to do used? So if we look, add to do. All right, so on submit, they're adding a to do item. Delete. So this would be the content within a table. So tbody is a table, and they're looping over the data that's coming from the to-do list, of which the to-do list is here. So after they get the result, they're setting that result to-dos. Where's to-dos? Ah, here. Okay, so array. Fetch. Yeah, I'm invoke add to do. I don't think this insert's actually used anywhere. And again, this is like, oh, okay. Interesting. So they're doing both in invoke, which is basically like firing off information to the backend, but then they're doing an insert here. And this is calling the db execute. And then, so basically every time they execute something, they're like reloading the database, basically. And like, yeah, when I say reloading, like literally calling database.load. So I don't think you need to do that. Like once you have a handle to the database, I think you can, like that, you need to like keep the context of the handle around and you can continue to reuse that handle. But when you provide like little snippets like that, I think that's communicating like that context in a little snippet like that is difficult. So there's value in like going from this, to this, because you can see, well, I can see this little snippet. This is the piece that I care about, but also how you wire it up matters. And like that's why folks write end-to-end tests or integration tests, because the unit is not enough to actually like describe or otherwise like make sure that that thing's gonna work at the end of the day. Yeah, so this feels like additional work that doesn't actually need to be done. Let's go ahead and look at how it is wired up to main. Okay, so the add to do, what they're doing with the command is like, are they like logging it out? Is that the intent here? Add to do. Oh. If we open up these side by side, routes. What's under lib actually? No, database. Last week. And what was the last thing that was updated? This 18 hours ago. Okay, so I'm guessing that they ended up just pulling in a bunch of stuff directly in here, but they were looking at abstracting out some of it, which makes sense. Toby, you said you actually don't like this implementation of the SQLX. Is it this plugin and how the plugin is implemented, or the SQLX portion of it? I mean, and I think that's also like where it's helpful to provide this context on like, you don't have to use SQLX. You could, in theory, wire it up yourself, and you only really need a plugin if you want some functionality on the front end. Okay, add to do item. Where's this used? Oh, interesting. We would maybe have to run this to like understand the intent here. But like, they're calling in an invoke and awaiting it to basically like get a formatted thing back. So they're doing some formatting here. So like the necessity of this is you probably don't need to do that communication go front end to back end, or front end or web view to Rust back to web view to actually format that. What you don't like is you execute the query from the front end, which is dumb because you should do it in Rust. I see where you're getting at. I wouldn't specifically call it dumb because I think there is situations where it could make sense. But I think your intent here is that the backend is best suited to be the thing that controls the database and the data. And that when you do that, you can then communicate that data to the front end. And you can do it in ways which doesn't actually require you to do SQL query in the web view. And there's also like you're communicating from a sandbox web view to a Rust backend. There is that communication there, and in theory, like somebody could dig into that web view. Like that's a place where people can inject like user code in theory. So the fact that you're sort of like exposing your local database to that WebView client, that's possibly a attack vector. I always encrypt local storage. Are you talking about local storage in the web view itself? Like there's also the like data that's living in this. I mean, you've got a SQLite database. So like at some point your browser local storage. Yeah. And like, so this is going to be what, like once you load it and you do a select, this is like you're loading data from something more persisted to something a little bit more ephemeral, to where if you reload the app, you're going to then reload this data. You're not actually like pulling out of the local storage. You did it with SQLite, and you also you multi-threaded it. Interesting. Yeah, you missed the beginning of the stream, Joe, but I was saying that this is starting to touch on the idea of what does a local first app look like in the Tauri space? In that there's a handful of services out there now with sort of like all-encompassing, we handle the infrastructure and we handle all the stuff for syncing, and we handle all of the actual like wiring it up into your UI. In some ways that can be nice, but also we have a little bit more flexibility in Tauri, which I think is kind of interesting, because you could put the database in like the Rust side of things, and then you could have that database still doing the syncing to something offsite. But then like the architecture is just different enough that I think it's a really interesting thing to dive into. So if you have something that is like open source or something that we can look at, I would be happy to check that out on a future stream. Nicola, you say that but if you expose the API, there's no saving you. Oh yeah. We're effectively exposing an API to the database. So in theory, you still can like lock up a bunch of it down, but a more secure alternative is less doors. If you have just a wall, it's going to be a lot harder for somebody to get in, as opposed to a wall with 7 doors that are all locked. All right, so if we jump back to the Rust, here's our migrations. You can see there's actually 2. So as the app evolves, we're going to have a continually like progressing list of migrations. And that's, as far as maintenance goes, I think that's probably one of the bigger difficulties. And then we wire it up. And I think this is pretty much going to be the default. Like every implementation of this, I would expect this to end up being the situation here, I think. You can encrypt the SQLite database, but you haven't tried it yet. Yeah, and I think, so what then, it starts to become interesting, because if you're encrypting it, now every time you access it, you pay that cost. So then is the SQLite database more of a local persistent store rather than a more direct state storage mechanism? Does that make sense? If you're going to encrypt the SQLite database, I feel like it would make sense to then load that data into the web view, act on it, and then at some point have events that go back to and like trigger additional updates or patch type information. So like the more you lock it down, the less you can use it directly. But also like what kind of data do you have? That encrypting it might actually be a necessity. And that starts to point towards, depending on the use case, it might not even make sense to use this plugin. It might make sense to communicate directly with some sort of database API. So, migration, yeah, as far as the docs go, I think this is probably going to be like the situation here. Like you're always going to be using the migration. You're probably pretty likely to write the migration in Rust. And then just generically, I think we're going to have to like work on communicating handles relative to like web app implementation. Because you're the front end and in JavaScript, you are setting up a handle and then acting on that handle. You don't need to set up that handle every time. And in some cases, that could potentially be a performance issue. So if, depending on what you're doing with this, if you're loading it on every interaction, it might be fine for the type of scale we're talking, but I mean, you're gonna even run into issues like this. Like just the fact that it's annoying in dev is a potential reason to like try to communicate that better. Okay. I think the next thing I want to look at is if we look at our to-do list here. Let's actually cross some of this stuff off. So we checked out the docs and we checked out Paul's example. Thank you for sharing that, Paul. I appreciate it. And if you end up watching this, Paul, or for everybody else watching too, the example is useful. And having these examples is useful as far as a communication tool. I don't know that there's a clear direction or path on how we can like marry or otherwise combine that data with what's actually in the docs. And that might be something that's worth having a discussion on GitHub or in Discord, because so like, but part of the reason we are working on the did I close it? Part of the reason we did this template is because it's wiring up 3, 4, 5, 6 different plugins. That doesn't really make sense in a guide anywhere. And there's enough wiring there that having something that you can just click a button and use the template for that use case is really helpful. But how do we add it into, or how do we allow the ecosystem to own that effectively? That's kind of an open question. All right. So you're doing all this with SQLite to be able to use it offline. I really like the idea of local first. I've been thinking of that as a pattern for a long time now, but I think only very recently, at least I've caught wind of it. There's like folks have basically dubbed the idea, and you know they've like attached the marketing piece to it, and I think it's a unique architecture and valuable for the user in multiple ways. Offline is one of those, probably one of the bigger ones. And then data ownership. Like those are probably the two biggest pieces that I think drive the reasons that I'm interested in it. Implementing it in a web app is one thing though, because you still do need to do some sort of like communication off of the device, and that kind of has to happen in the cloud, right? But I think in general, like the way local first works right now, just holistically, you have to have something in the cloud. There has to be some sort of like sync communication method. Otherwise, it's sort of a non-starter. But I think there's potentially a pattern where we can enable an intermediary step, which is allow that syncing to happen locally as enabled through a Tauri app, because the Tauri app is sort of like a local server in some ways. So I think there's always going to be a use case for having something in the cloud and like a database mechanism. But it feels like it's a very big trade-off right now. You're either going like full local first, but as soon as you want to do anything more than a user working on a single device, then you have to use the cloud. Somewhere in that spectrum, I think is the place that I want to explore. Like in the middle of that spectrum. I don't think it needs to be as definitive of a transition. All right. So the last thing that I wanted to do was see if there's any other implementations out there. So and again, Charles, if you have that SQLite integration and that's something you want to share, no, you know, to make it clear, I'm not putting you on the spot now, and I'm not expecting you to give it to me. But if that's something you're interested in having us go through on stream, I would love to do that. But I do want to see if we have any other. It might be under the plugins. This is I think an official one now. Sentry, analytics, clipboard, an IPC wrapper, theme. I don't see anything there. So some articles. Data. Is this? Oh, this is under applications. Okay. Okay, so this is a viewer. So that's an app that allows you to view SQLite. Nifty. What else do we got? Yeah, so it doesn't seem like there's really too much else out there. I suspect that if you're not using the plugin, you're probably doing something more custom. I would be... Like, does it even make sense to have a diesel flavored there's diesel. So 1 million, let's say. And if we look at SQLX, 3 million. So like, I think that's probably the biggest one, eh? I can't think of any other ones. Oh, you said Rusculate? No, no T. Yeah. Okay, 3 million. That one is specifically SQLite, but I mean, that's a fair amount. It does in some ways compete with SQLX. And I suspect that SQLite is probably going to be the bigger one. It feels like it's hard to justify a space where we have a plugin for every one of these ORM/database setups. But also, I wouldn't expect everybody to use or want to use SQLX. I don't know. I'm still pretty open on how that fits into place. The so to your thought, gun.js or gun and Rust, there is a handful of these. Gun.js. Ooh, that's a little motion sensitivity issues there. I'm looking for the like tagline. Documentation maybe? Yeah, so like this whole idea, but everything that I've found, and if y'all have found otherwise, I'm happy to I would love to hear about it. But pretty much all of them are like full end to end. So they're expecting here like hello world. Let's look at the hello world. No, that's pretty it's very hello worldy to do. Oh, this is like a okay. Yep, sure. To be like a final state. Yeah. Very JavaScripty, but or jQuery, nice. You don't see that too much anymore. Like you've got the gun. So SQLite has SQLX in it already. Oh, really? Interesting. Okay. This feels very much in the same vein of like what the SQL plugin is also doing. It's giving you this. But like in some ways like every one of these have implemented from infrastructure all the way to the front end. I'm interested in the middle of that and how we can change that idea, but also like now we're dependent on maybe like a 60 to 80% implementation of like what functionality I would want to use on the front end, because there's like the data that you store in the database isn't going to be the exact same as you would be displaying to the user. Like there should be some expectation of what I have in the database might take a little massaging, or I might want to do operations on it that are outside of like default database expectations. Like a database has like filtering mechanisms, so I can return a subset of the data. But like if I've got a date or I have something that needs a little bit of conversion, like currencies, how I save it in the database is not going to be how I display it to the user. And I feel like all the front ends are like 60 to 80% of what I would like to see. So that what I'm interested in is that syncing mechanism to the infrastructure. Like that's the piece that I kind of want them to handle. I don't want to have to deal with the syncing. But they're like gun.js, there's what Turo, replicache, Tinybase. We did Tinybase on stream a handful of months ago back, and that's sort of like a meta framework on top of some of these. What else we got? Like I think I've got a whole bunch of tabs up, and I've been diving into this idea. Electric SQL, I can't believe I forgot about that. YJS, CR SQLite. Zero is no one coming out of the Reflect replicache folks. RxDB, remote storage, Evalu. There's options, but they all look like this. So if I'm missing something, please comments. I would love to hear about it. And then I think what I would love would be something that handles all that syncing mechanism, but then also works in it works in the context of Tauri, in that a Tauri app could potentially have like a local sync function to it. So if I've got a Tauri app open on my Windows computer and a Tauri app open on my Mac, it would be cool to have those be able to sync. But this, all of the existing things don't seem to be getting us there, at least without a whole bunch of chopping. And this isn't going to get us there, because there's still some like the same issue. It's just that now we don't have the infrastructure portion of it either. There's still that, like, I have data and I also want to show the data, but in a slightly different way. And there's libraries out there built with that intention. So like, Redux and Reselect and all the other like state management libraries, like what is that? how am I blanking on it? Xstate. There we go. Wow. Yeah, like all those state libraries, like they've got that functionality at the front end that I'm interested or looking for, where there's the idea of like derived data. What's interesting about Gun is that it is peer-to-peer. So if you put it in an app and you have lots of users, it's better than a website that would use Gun. And like, there is like I don't remember if it's this one. There's been a couple databases or database-like things called Gun, and I've lost context on which is which. Featured here. Can we look at, like, how old is this? 5 years? This might be the same one. Oh, 9 years ago. Okay, so I think this is maybe the same one that I'm thinking about then. Yeah. And I think so. Like, that peer-to-peer stuff is part of the piece that I'm interested in. But where does that peer-to-peer happen? Would that end up happening as part of the web view? Because it would be nice to actually have that handled in the Rust side of things. Because I think also with the peer-to-peer is you need to start considering, like, how do the users factor into the peer-to-peer part of it? It's easier if the peer-to-peer is public generic data. It's less so if it's like specific user data and I only want to sync it between my phone and my computer. So yeah, like it feels like there's a lot of these that are checking something like 60 to 80% of the boxes that I'm looking for on my list of perfection. But they all either just like control too much or controlled in a way that I'm not interested in. So Gun was definitely on my list of like ones that I've been looking at. Then I think we're getting to the end of the stream here. This topic is probably something that we're going to continue to dive on, or at least I'm interested in continuing to bring up. Because I think with Tauri, there's an interesting architecture and setup that we can push towards. But it doesn't feel like if we push towards a point that I'm imagining in my head, I don't see anything out there right now that is going to fit that. The use case of a Rust thing handling the sync to a cloud, but then also peer-to-peer, and then still delivering data to the front end. Because like if you use Gun.js and it's doing the syncing in the web view, what if you have multiple windows? Yeah, you get like a distributed database between users. Yeah. Like it would be nice if I could open up a web app on my desktop and just any of my devices on the network would just then get the syncing capability. Like having a sync service or something in the cloud is great. I don't have to think about it. But if my internet goes down or I have poor internet, then I start losing that ability. But then there's also like privacy concerns and data ownership, which is could be more valuable depending on the context of what app you're doing. And in some ways, like if I'm making an app that I want to provide to users at some free tier, but then also potentially charge for other features, like a cloud syncing service would be something that would be, I think, reasonable to charge for. There's cost involved. But then if you could still support the like use case of, well, just open this and leave it open on your desktop and you'll get very similar functionality, it just won't be quite as nice. But then you're basically like allowing somebody to use this thing and it's not actually costing any infrastructure, or it's not costing any money as far as infrastructure goes, which I think is kind of an interesting like freemium scaling type model, which in some ways scales a little bit outside of like how we were traditionally delivering web apps and having this dependence on infrastructure, and especially with like all the AI machine learning type stuff. The compute requirements for that, just that alone, I feel like is starting to, compute requirements is going to sink businesses. So pushing on the other side of that is something I'm interested in. I think that's going to be where we call it, though. Thanks for the good questions and thoughts, y'all. I definitely do. I appreciate diving into the local first development job. Starting to lose my voice too, I think. Yeah, it would work great in collaborative scenarios. So like big data, like if you got a big chunk of data, like you're working on models or something like that, being able to like sync that cleanly would be like, think like a multiplayer local, a local first multiplayer video editing app. That's like, you can kind of do it, and there are some programs that kind of do it, but there's a lot of big files there, and a lot of those video files are not going to be they're not going to make sense to upload to the cloud unless you're on different sites. If you're in different states or different countries, like obviously you're gonna have to use the internet. But if you're in the same office or in the same network, I think there's a lot of really interesting use cases. So appreciate the thoughts and feel free to keep them coming. Drop those comments below, and we'll keep following up on this topic. But speaking of topics, before we call it, I already have the next 2 streams scheduled, and then after that, I think we're gonna end up skipping a week. But feel free to hit those buttons to get notifications. We've got some interesting things coming from the folks at Crab Nebula, and Attila is coming on stream and chatting with us about them. So I'm excited. We've been trying to get the schedules to line up for some time, so I'm excited to see those land. So do the YouTube functionality and press those buttons. And I'll see you next week. Have a great rest of the week, y'all. Happy Tuesday. And I will see you on the next one.